Do you go to sleep at night thinking about zoning maps? Ever say, I wonder if I live in an RS3. Maybe I live in a CM1. Nope, probably not. Who does that? Maybe people in the zoning department. Maybe it's like one of those bad dreams that they have. Either way, if you're an investor, if you're a homeowner in Chicago and you want to understand, hey, what do I do with the zoning map? Why is this beneficial? Today is the overview of zoning maps. Let's try not to make this too complicated today. Before we get too far, please, if you've never done this before, please subscribe, like, comment, engage. Let us know what you think. I'd love to get your input as we're going through this video. I'm sure it's not perfect. Let us know how we can make it better. And then in addition to that, don't forget to subscribe. With that said, if we're going to understand what zoning is in Chicago, let's start at the very beginning. So this is a map that is very important in Chicago's history. It's the map that Daniel Burnham created in the Plan of Chicago for 1909. It's the first time Chicago tried to map out the entire zones of Chicago and lay out what the entire city should look like. Beforehand, they did have like building codes and permits, especially 1871. You have the Chicago fire. You definitely needed to make sure that houses, again, aren't made only of wood because they discovered, maybe that could light up like a tinderbox and go burn up half the city. So what happens here is that 1909, they start looking at the city in general and say, how can we plan out the city to make sure that we're building it out responsibly and correctly, and it gives the most use and the best use for all of our citizens. Now, that map has changed over time, and as you can see by the map that I was showing you before, it has become what you see before you. I mean, there were major changes in the 50s, the 80s. 2004 was the modernization that you see before you. Now, obviously, there have been changes since then. I think this map, by the way, the site here that we're on dates back to 2017. So over time, this has changed. However, it's important to understand what's on here. Now, there's a lot of things here. If you look at this key here on the right-hand side, and there's a lot of different uses for this. Like we could talk about transportation, CTA, public schools, TIF districts, aldermanic wards. We can talk about how Section 8, you could use this for that because they use zoning maps to understand how to determine rents. But one of the things I want to talk to you today about is understanding the different zoning codes so you know what you can build in specific areas. Now, the majority of what we're going to be talking about today is related to the majority of what people use. You can see here on the right, business, commercial, manufacturing, residential. Those are what some of the major ones are. However, if you, let's say you zoom into the downtown area of the city, we're here at Kinsey and Clark, you can see there's a lot of planned development uses here, planning and development here. And you can see DC as well. So like I said, a lot of this is downtown type usages. Just trying to see here if I can find specific right-hand column. You can see, by the way, the color coded for business is that pink. If I scroll down here, I can see there's some historic resources here because this is the merchandise mart, by the way. That's why this is in red. But it's very different throughout the city. So if I were to scroll up here, let's say I go to the north side, let's take a look at, let's go Old Irving. Was this Irving Park? Yeah, Western Montrose, Western Irving. Let's see where we're at. It's very different up here. This, on the other hand, is a big sea of yellow for residential. Now, even in residential, though, you can see that there's different types of residential. There's RS2 versus RS3. By the way, RS2, which is lower than RS3, means there's probably less building sizes. So you're going to see more single family in an RS2 than you would in an RS3. RS3 will probably have more multi-units. You're allowed more units in an RS3 in general. Like I think RS1 is only single family, but RS2 is single and 2 flats or something like that. And then RS3 can maybe allow up to 4 units. But also in addition to that, you can see when you get to the major streets, you see Lincoln over here on the right, and I see Western over here in somewhere a little bit off to the left. And you can see both of those are business areas. And you'll see a lot of businesses in those places. And not surprising. People know to expect that you're going to see business in a business area. But you can see, by the way, every time here, look where it says Zoning Board of Appeals. So a lot of these buildings have actually gone to the Board of Appeals to be zoned. So they've had some type of variance or special use that they've asked for permission. Look how many of these properties, as you look around, have gone through a zoning board of appeals process. But the thing to keep in mind is that if you're developing a property, at some point or another, you might have to talk to zoning. Now, if you're keeping a single family, and you're just rehabbing the interior, you're not going to have to worry about it. But if you're going into a single family and you say, hey, look, I want to add 2 floors to that single family, well, that's a problem, because you might not be able to have it over a certain height based on whether it's an RS2 or an RS3. You also might not be able to add more units. Now, I know Chicago has been very big into doing ADUs, and they're trying to add more rental stock. So it's very possible that you can probably get a variance for some of that. And some of these Board of Appeals might even be variances for some of the things we're talking about here today. But the other thing to keep in mind is that, like, what are the setback coverages? How much interior space, like that's a big area, the floor area ratio, are you allowed to build on? I went to a property yesterday or 2 days ago where there was a fire and there were 4 buildings and all of them are connected, and all 4 buildings blew up in flames. Now, nowadays, you probably want to have a little bit of separation, have that little alley in between to not have that. However, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, you might not have had that requirement. So understanding that is very important. Most Chicago lots are 25 by 125 in terms of their space. But that means that you might not only be able to use 20 feet, which means you might have to have 2.5 feet on each side to give space so you're not touching the building next to you. And that's an important distinction. In addition to that, when you're going through, whether you need a variance, whether you're grandfathered into a space, we have a space that's in a B1 zone, and we had some issues when we were looking to get financing because they're like, oh, this should be a commercial space. It can't be a single family home. We're like, no, the property's been there since 1907. As you saw before, the plan of Chicago from Daniel Burnham was 1909. They didn't even have zoning until 1923. How would we be able to know that we were zoned incorrectly in 1907 when the first zoning didn't even come out until 16 years later? So with that said, it's important to know that, because then you could be able to make the case that whether you need that zoning or not. Also, the big thing that you really have to know at the end of the day is how long will this take? If you have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, how many extra months will this add? Especially if you're doing financing for a project, how much extra money will this cost in holding because of the fact your property is just sitting there and you're not able to get work done on it? So it's important to know what that looks like if you're working on a project. So this has been Andy Nathan coming to you from Creative Smart Contractors, talking today about zoning. I hope you found this information valuable. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know in the comments what questions you have. I know we didn't discuss everything about zoning, but this has been an overview video. With that said, have a great day and a better week.